Very good. Well, welcome everybody to this year's annual lecture of the Academy of Social Sciences. Delighted that now I've got to get all his titles correct and in the correct order. Professor Sir Geoff Mulgan, CBE, who's at the moment at the Public Policy and Social Innovation Centre at UCL, is going to give, I think, a startlingly challenging lecture. But just a word of background on Geoff. I first met him 30 years ago when he was working for Gordon Brown. He then had a spell directing Demos, which was part of the kind of exciting web of ideas in the run of the 97 general election. He then worked in the policy unit number 10 with Tony Blair. Lots of achievements in that period, actually. One I think that I still remember you being proud of, Geoff. I hope you still are proud of it, which is requiring private schools to show demonstrably that they produce public benefit. You left there and you joined the Young Foundation. Again, a period of incredible social innovation. You left there to become director of Nesta, and you've just stood down from there. And for the last 18 months, you've been working at UCL. You've written, we were laughing before our audience joined us, some miles of books, maybe 2 or maybe 5 miles worth of books. Collective intelligence is where your kind of focus has been. Geoff has worked with many governments, it should be said, not just the British government over the last kind of 30 years. And people turn to him from kind of South Korea through Colombia, many European countries, for insight, everything from kind of cities to kind of just how to do policy more cleverly. And it's a great privilege to have you giving this lecture. And I'm sure I'm going to give a name check to a forthcoming book, Another World is Possible, Another World is Possible, which is published today. And we're particularly pleased to have Geoff because he's just emerging from a spell of COVID. And it's really fantastic of you to kind of sum up the energy to give this lecture. Geoff, with no more ado, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Will. Thank you all for letting me pull you away from a gorgeous summer's evening, which I hope I will keep you pulled away from, to try and share some thoughts and perhaps, as Will said, some challenges, I think, for social science in the moment we're in. And I'll share some challenges, but also what I hope are some remedies. And some ideas which can be drawn from history, the arts, music, to feed into the next phase of social science. I'm going to share my screen occasionally, partly because I've looked at the evidence that looking at yourself on a screen is quite unsettling. And many people in the last 2 years have struggled as they've had to sit in meetings looking at themselves. So I'm going to try and sometimes stop doing that. And I'm going to start with sort of where we are. The word crisis is very overused, but I think there's no doubt we're in a moment of almost layering up of crises. We haven't really recovered from the 2007 financial crash, which has left so many people with stagnant incomes. That in turn fueled the political crises, which gave us Brexit and Trump, and and a steady, almost generational decline in confidence in democracy, with the long-standing climate crisis, but reaching new peaks with temperatures in the 60s in India this summer. Obviously, we've had COVID, we've got war, we've got energy price spikes, we've got the likelihood of crises around hunger, and we've in some ways seen history begin to move backwards with the return of strongmen leaders, tanks, brutal civilian deaths, and worries about hunger now displacing worries about obesity. And this should be a moment when the social sciences are in their element, diagnosing, prescribing, proposing, making sense of both what's happening, but also what could be done differently. And I'm going to argue that some of our sort of structures and systems actually are not really helping us do that. So what I want to start with is a thought experiment. My guess is the average age amongst those of you watching this is probably in the 40s or 50s. And that means, given your socioeconomic backgrounds, you probably will be around in 40 years' time. So I'm asking you to close your eyes, picture yourself, perhaps sipping Ovaltine in your rocking chair, perhaps out of your mind on psychedelic drugs, or playing with your great-grandchildren, hopefully not doing all of those at the same time. But I want you to think about what's happening outside your front door. Obviously, levelling up will have been done. The care system will have been sorted out. But what do you picture happening in the street, in the school, in the workplace? Now, over the last 2 or 3 years, I've interviewed a lot of academics and politicians and charity and business leaders all over the world. And I've found they really struggle to answer this question. They can picture ecological disaster. Hollywood is really good at doing that too, climate catastrophe. And they can probably picture technology futures, a world dominated by robots and drones. But most struggle to get beyond the fuzziest blur in describing what our society could look like, our social future, not our technological future. So next bit of the thought experiment is, again, imagine 2062, you've just won a landslide election victory, which isn't wholly implausible. It's only 2 or 3 years since Mahathir Mohamad in Malaysia won re-election at the age of 92. So maybe you've still got a prospect ahead. Obviously, you'll be hosting lots of champagne parties, reintroducing wine time at 4 p.m. But what would you be using your power for? What would you be legislating? Now, again, I find that even highly educated people struggle with that question. Not many have even the vaguest draft Queen's speech in their back pocket. And I think this matters. And I think that any society needs a menu of options, of possibilities from which to draw, particularly if we're facing mounting crises. We need some sense of the road ahead, a map of the future which doesn't take us to ecological ruin or being enslaved by robots. And one important psychological reason for this was articulated by Viktor Frankl in his classic work on concentration camp survivors, where he showed that whether prisoners survived depended hugely on whether they had hope for the future. If they lost it, their mental and physical health tended to decline. And yet, and here's another picture to show, if you look at polling around the world, probably for the first time in 200 years, large majorities expect their children to be worse off than them, 70 to 23 in the UK. Look at France, Japan. And it's probably worse than when this poll was done, because this was pre-COVID. So we're in a weird position where we've lost that sense of hope. You may have seen extraordinary research last year looking at patterns of sentiment in all the books published around the world in English, German, and Spanish over the last 150 years. And the researchers showed this pattern you can see here for the last 100, 150 years, relatively stable patterns. And then in about 2000, something weird goes on, which they call an upsurge of cognitive distortions. And they write of large populations stressed by pervasive cultural, economic, social changes, correlating with rising prevalence of depression and anxiety. And this catastrophizing, which you can see in the top left-hand diagram, seems to have been happening as utopias have been completely displaced by dystopias in our collective mind. And this shrinking back of the future matters, I think, politically for fairly obvious reasons. It fuels what the German sociologist Andreas Reckwitz called the switch from positive politics, which emphasizes the openness, possibility of the future, to a negative politics, which is skeptical, nostalgic, convinced the best years lie in the past. Now, it's possible that we really are all indeed objectively doomed, but it seems to me implausible we could know that with any certainty. And it's surely better to try and think our way out of our many crises, because if we don't even try, then we certainly will be doomed and will deserve to be. So for my lecture, I've chosen this phrase possibility space, which actually comes from maths and statistics. And there it refers to all the possible outcomes from an experiment, like all the results of a throw of the dice in maths. And I'm trying to use this phrase in a similar way to think of all the possibilities which there might be for our society if we look 20, 40, 60 years into the future from now. It's never possible to define the size or shape of that space precisely, but we do know it's fairly likely the big nations will still be roughly the same shape in 20 years' time. The big cities will still be dominant. We can tell it's fairly unlikely the dreams of creating Greater Russia, Greater Hungary, Greater Turkey will be realized. And it's probably pretty unlikely there'll be a revival of a Mongolian empire or that Donald Trump will become a Buddhist monk. Now, the size of this space depends on many things, structures, inheritances, institutions, and so on, but it also depends on imagination. How much work is done to create new possibilities for societies to move into. So as an example, all the work done in the first half of the 20th century on the possibility of a universal health service made it much easier to then create an NHS in the 1940s. Decades of work on how a circular economy might work has made it more possible that we can retreat from fast fashion or the mountains of e-waste which seem to grow every year. So that's the reason for trying to use this concept of a possibility space. And I argue there are long traditions in social science of not only trying to analyze the world, but also to shape it. Adam Smith, Condorcet, Comte, Jeremy Bentham, whose institution I work in, and of course Karl Marx, whose grave famously was inscribed with the comment, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world, the point is to change it." From their origins, in other words, the social sciences were concerned with shaping the future as well as understanding the present. But this tradition has partly disappeared. Almost exactly 100 years ago, H.G. Wells wrote that sociology is the description of the ideal society and its relation to existing societies. But actually, not many sociologists take that view now. There are many exceptions. Very celebrated figures like Eleanor Ostrom or Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum, working on both theory and design. And I think in social science, there's an echo of the story in the natural sciences, which John Agar wrote about brilliantly in his History of Science in the 20th century, where he showed that even the most apparently theoretical breakthroughs often came from engaging with what he called working world problems. And there are plenty of pockets of active design of the future, mechanism design, societal transformations. But overall, this kind of work has become harder in recent years. And if you search for well-informed proposals on how our welfare system could work, or democracy, or tax a generation or two from now, it's surprising how little you find. So why is this? Well, I think my diagnosis would be this has partly happened as an unintended and unfortunate byproduct of quite perfectly sound, well-intentioned shifts. So healthy pressures to attend to hard data and evidence have had the unintended consequence of squeezing out attention to the future, because by definition, evidence and data refer to the present and past. A very well-intentioned focus on impact has encouraged incremental work on policy, how to tweak a little, aligned with the interests of the government of the day, but discouraged serious design of how our society might be very different a generation out. And of course, a brilliant idea that will only flourish 30 years from now won't show up in the ref. A healthy commitment to rigor has made it hard or even career-threatening to be creative, because any genuinely new idea does risk sounding flaky, vague, half-baked when it's in its infancy. And as evidence now shows very clearly, the very valid reliance on peer review as a near universal assessment method by its nature discourages the boldest, most speculative thinking. It favors safe proposals over the radical ones, which tend to get both some very high scores and some very low ones. And I think the result of this is many of the brightest younger social scientists opt either for analytical work or the safer space of commentary and critique, but steer clear of the riskier space of saying what they think should be done, because they will not be rewarded for doing so. So how might we better expand our sense of possibility space? Well, there are lots and lots of traditions of foresight and futures and scenarios, and all sorts of wonderful traditions. So I'm just getting back to my screen here, which are on the edges of social science, of utopian thinking, back to Thomas More, Edward Bellamy in the 19th century, interesting books like Kim Stanley Robinson's book, The Ministry of the Future, which starts with a climate crisis in India, not different from what we're having at the moment, or Ursula Le Guin's extraordinary work such as The Dispossessed. These writings have helped us to think in different ways. So have the many attempts to create model towns and cities like New Lanark in Scotland, which Robert Owen built alongside his writings as a demonstration of cooperation, or the garden cities like Letchworth, Welwyn Garden City, or more recent eco-towns like Freiburg. My family comes from New Zealand, so I like to think of it as a generator of possibility space, the first country to give women the vote, one of the first modern welfare states, more recently the first government to really try and embed well-being into its budgets, or to give legal personhood to nature and rivers, as it did about 5 years ago. Now, these are all examples of how we can expand our possibility space, but of course we have to do that with caution. Philip Tetlock wrote a brilliant book a few years ago on political judgment, which showed in relation to forecasting geopolitical events involving Russia, not only non-experts, but even Norwegian rats could outperform the experts in making specific forecasts. Of course, the rats were making it randomly. That was his point. And I think every social scientist learns early that change is much more complex than our capacity to understand it. There are steady long-term trends in demography or technology or even values, but it's very hard to predict in any detail what the future will bring. Very few in 1900 expected a brutal world war. Few in 1925 expected a boom, a depression, another war. Few in the 50s talked about the cultural revolutions of the 60s. Few in the 80s expected the imminent collapse of the USSR or resurgent Islamic fundamentalism or the rise of personal computing. Just as few in the 2000s anticipated the scale of the financial crisis or the boom in populist authoritarianism, or that the world would not much later grind to a halt thanks to a pandemic. And I suspect not many people in this conversation predicted last year a brutal war this year and a glorious time for oil companies. And here, the amazing explosion of data at our hands actually doesn't help very much, because the data will always be from the past, and the world isn't actually very probabilistic or very predictable. And if anything, the models lull us into thinking we understand more than we do. Now, one option is just to stop bothering, but I think there are very good reasons for trying to engage with futures understanding. Regular exercises to predict and then reflect on what actually happened are wonderful for cultivating humility, but also improving our models of how the world works. I speak as someone who twice forecast a revolution in Saudi Arabia, which I think hasn't happened yet, several recessions which didn't materialize, and who actually put a money bet on Boris Johnson being out by the end of last year. Now, clearly something was wrong with my models of how the world works, and hopefully I learned a bit by thinking about why I got those things wrong. And this kind of engagement with the future also protects us against confirmation bias, this tendency, which is even more marked with very well-educated, highly intelligent people, to select the information that confirms our views, not that which challenges us. I'm sure all of you know brilliant thinkers with complex understandings of the world who can fit almost any new piece of information into their frameworks, however much it appears to and should challenge their assumptions. So I think often it's the cleverest who need to be doing this kind of rigorous engagement with the surprises, with the unpredictable. And such engagement also helps us remember how fluid and plastic the world can be. Karl Marx wrote about reification, how social relationships take on the appearance of solid things. And it's important to see their fluidity to understand what can change. I've mentioned Ursula Le Guin. I think in retrospect, she was one of the most important social thinkers of the last century. And she justified science fiction in these terms as a training for the imagination, a warning against excessive reification, which is particularly useful for hard-nosed realists who every now and then become incredibly unrealistic, as happened in February this year, when most of the best informed experts told us in February that Putin wouldn't invade Ukraine, And then, rather like Putin's media, quickly shifted from saying war was impossible to saying it was inevitable. This kind of exercise of looking at what trends will shift or bend or accelerate is really useful for our models of the world and for understanding the pace of change in everything from infrastructures, which still take 30, 40, 50 years to change, to the world of TikTok, which changes week by week. But what I want to really focus on here is not just how we understand the world, but also how we shape it. And here I think there's a striking sort of contrast between social science and the other sciences right now. If you work in life sciences or computer sciences, it's taken for granted that if you're ambitious, you speculate, you design options for the future, new drugs, new algorithms. You're encouraged by research councils, venture capital, your university departments to generate ideas. It's assumed that most ideas will fail, but the rare successes will be useful and incredibly valuable. And so this kind of imagination is supported by conferences, accelerators, funds, think tanks, smart cities, smart homes, AI, much of it speculative and hot air, but some of it very real and feeding into well-developed systems which support the generation of ideas, the selection of the good ones, and the scaling of the best. In social action, social policy, the social world, there's almost nothing comparable. Little support for variation and radicalism, not much for experiment. And although there are some interesting attempts, particularly in Australia and Canada at the moment, to create social R&D systems, we don't have anything comparable in the UK. And this leads to weird imbalances. So the internet, I think, is a glaring example of this. We're all on it now. For the last 30 years, it's transformed our lives. There's been enormous spending on R&D for targeted advertising and search and so on, but incredibly little serious R&D on the social aspects of the internet, how to mitigate some of its harms. And that was true even in the 2000s, when it was already clear that as there were people's numbers of Facebook friends went up, support, mutual support, the capacity to rely on people in many countries was going down. And it's only been in the last 5 or 6 years, probably since the election of Donald Trump, there've been really big research programs on misinformation, democratic corrosion, manipulation of children, and very little serious policy work on alternative ways of reshaping the internet. And one of the best books of recent years is a case in point, Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism. It's a brilliant hundreds and hundreds of pages of diagnosis of data-driven predatory capitalism, but literally nothing to suggest what might be done to change that. And I think this failure of the social sciences, and I'll call it out, to support a similar kind of engagement with options and alternatives has consequences. And here, really just for Will's sake, I'm going to turn to Milton Friedman, Will's favorite economist. He's not everyone's favorite, but this quote from him, I think, is spot on. Friedman wrote that only a crisis produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And that, I believe, is and he meant social scientists, economists, our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. Now, you may not agree with anything else Friedman wrote, but I think he was right about this. And it is vital for any society to have alternatives lying around. Now, as Will said, I've worked in the center of quite a few governments, in Downing Street, in Canberra, in Ottawa, Washington, Helsinki, and elsewhere. And one of the odd things you discover is the people in the heart of governments often are a bit clueless about what's going on in the world around them. They usually feel quite powerless, much more powerless than you might expect. But they also often feel this lack of options, of things they might do. And I've seen again and again, diving into a new field, you expect there to be lots of options out there, but when you really dig deep, you find there aren't that many, and those there are fairly vague and sketchy. Last week, I heard Adam Price, who's the leader of Plaid Cymru, comment on this. He called it the 10th chapter problem. So many books offering brilliant diagnoses of what's wrong with our society or economy in 9 chapters, and then a 10th chapter of prescriptions which are rather bland, conventional, and unconvincing. Now, there are good reasons for social science to want to focus on the evidence, on what we already know, and not just to speculate. I spend much of my time helping to run the International Public Policy Observatory. We gather evidence from around the world on what's being done around COVID in mental health or care or education or the life of cities. And it's right to want to distill, synthesize the best available knowledge. I would rather that the people with power over me, whether they're a surgeon in a hospital or a government minister, were using tried and tested methods and not using me as a guinea pig. But I think we've overshot. And this is where I want to turn in the last part of this lecture to what could be done, how we can grow the possibility spaces, how we can use social science to generate new options. And here I want to use as inspiration an amazing film you may have seen from the 1950s called The Mystery of Picasso. In that film, you see Picasso painting on a glass screen. You see him paint a beautiful picture, then you see him sort of rub it out in black, paint something new, change it, alter it, fuse it, and you realize this is his method. His method is to try lots and lots of things with extraordinary fertility and then to select the best ones. And of course, that's what biology does. It's what evolution does. It multiplies options and then selects a small number of them to take forward. Linus Pauling, one of the very few people to win 2 Nobel Prizes, said, the only way to get good ideas is to have lots of ideas and discard the bad ones. But this is actually quite rare in social science, and it's pretty rare in policy, where we usually prefer a much more linear process of analysis and then prescription. And often people jump to their first prescription or solution rather than trying to generate 10, 20, 50, or 100, even though this is very common in the arts and in design and in business. Tim Harford wrote a great article on this about a week or 2 ago on this point, and he used the example of the Windows startup sound, which Brian Eno wrote, 3.8 seconds, which he got to by trying to create literally hundreds of alternatives to choose from. Now, I'm interested in the methods we could be using more in the social sciences to expand possibility space. And this is one of the frameworks I've used a lot with many groups, where you simply take an existing thing like a library or childcare or pensions or tax, and you use these methods to multiply your options. You look at, say, extension, where you take some aspect of existing practice and extend it, as Bach did with extending fugues to 6 voices, or extending the idea of rights to animals or nature, or extending school hours, or extending suffrage to 16-year-olds or 6-year-olds. There's grafting, where you take an idea from one field and apply it to another, as painting has reabsorbed photography, as economists did taking the idea of the auction into electromagnetic spectrum, or the idea of the jury reintegrated into democracy with citizen juries. Or inversion is the radical one, as the Middle Ages did with carnivals, where one day a year the rich would be poor and the poor would be rich. And this is a very fertile tool for generating options. It helped the Grameen Bank turn farmers into bankers. Or you think about what happens if patients can be doctors, or if social care can be provided by former recipients of social care, or if consumers become makers of things. Addition is useful. Baroque Hindu architecture, extreme examples of addition, and any social service can add things on, like a family doctor who starts offering advice on welfare or debt. Subtraction, though, is, if anything, even more interesting. Very important in modernist art and music, like Malevich's painting White on White, or John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds of silence. But you can also apply it in social contexts. What if you took half the roles in a hierarchy away, or introduced a maximum income? I've worked with parks having to cope with 50% budget cuts, and sometimes that generates much more creative solutions, just as the cheap prices in our supermarkets now reflect the idea of Clarence Saunders in Memphis in the early 20th century, who had the inspired idea of subtracting service staff and letting customers pack their own bags. And sometimes not doing things is better than doing them. There's a surprising example from the military experience on PTSD, where they learned that taking immediate action to treat soldiers sometimes made it worse, and it was better to let people mobilize their own resources and then focus on the 4 or 5% who really needed it, the help. And of course, things like veganism are examples of innovative subtraction from diets, whereas all the new regulatory methods around energy or transport try to reduce consumption rather than increasing it. Now, there's a whole range of more sophisticated methods. Many of these are in my book, which are in use, sometimes in government, sometimes in academia, sometimes out of it, to try and help us generate alternative pictures of the future, sometimes using metaphor, alternative worlds, and so on. But they're not very widely used, and most of the incentives of peer-reviewed journals and funding and disciplinary organization actually point against them and are not allowing us to generate options, new alternatives on isolation or food insecurity. There are some counterexamples. This is one from last week when Cardiff launched its social science park, Spark, which is bringing together in a beautiful building, some lovely architecture, academics, think tanks, civil servants, civil society, to become a crucible, I hope, of the kind of exploratory social science I think we need, creating new combinations of people to solve problems. And of course, Wales has its Future Generations Commissioner, an act which helps it, gives it license to think into the future. Just last week, we ran a 2-week course at UCL, which I helped design for nearly 1,500 students from engineering and business and other backgrounds, where they had to work in teams of 8, generating new solutions to problems of air quality in Delhi, Nairobi, and London, trying to think in an interdisciplinary way, a creative way, an expansive way on how to use their knowledge to solve problems. And I think there's another related stream of work which may be relevant to social science, which is the attempts to create museums of the future. We have thousands of museums in the UK now, but we don't have a museum in our cities or towns where we can go to think about or explore what could care for the elderly look like, or education, or local neighborhood management in 40 or 50 years' time. This is the one from Dubai, launched a few months ago, great expense, but with some extraordinary sort of content, which draws actually rather well on social science and philosophy, as well as on technology. And I think all of these examples show that it is actually possible to have quality in this sort of exploratory work. You can interrogate ideas to see, are they plausible economically, psychologically, culturally? Are they logical? Do they fit together? As well as asking whether they are creative. And the best ones are quite specific, sharply enough defined, you can interrogate them. I've always loved the comment from Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist, who said of an impressive theory is not only not right, it isn't even wrong, meaning it wasn't sufficiently sharply defined to be proven either true or false. Now, the other main objection I hear to these sort of ideas is the argument that if you do exploratory social science, you're encouraging half-baked utopias to be imposed on countries rather as Pol Pot or Lenin or Mao did in the past. And it's a very valid fear, precisely for the reason I said earlier, that social life is far more complex than our brains or our theories can cope with. But there is a good answer. The answer is to experiment. It's always been common in health to experiment with new drugs. It's now much more mainstream in business. Companies like Google and Amazon always ABC test new services. And in some governments like Canada and Finland, it's become much more normal to test out new ideas before implementing them at scale. The award of the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2019 to Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee rewarded their work on experimentation in development. Now, it's clear RCTs and experiments are not a panacea. They're particularly ill-suited to some things like systemic change. But a commitment to the experimental method is a good protection against the vices of bad imagination and overreach. Another protection is democracy. Involve the people who will be the beneficiaries of ideas in shaping them. And here I think we've got a great example from the last 2 years, which I've helped on a bit, which was the Community Fund's Emerging Futures Fund, which funded 50 communities around the UK to develop their collective imagination, to think about what kind of town or city or region they wanted to see in the future. And these are very healthy processes. There are lots of examples of them from around the world, often involving academics as well as civil society activists. And at their best, these are quite educational. So for example, if you want a community to think about its long-term care needs, start with a surprising fact. Amongst the elderly, cold symptoms are less likely amongst the highly sociable than the less sociable. So why is that? Well, it turns out, of course, it's because loneliness has such devastating effects on both physical and mental health. So, and from that idea, you get to very different solutions, not just putting people in care homes, but ensuring they have sociability, friendship, activities. Or start with a fact. In the US last year, in the midst of the pandemic, 48% of the lowest paid jobs were deemed essential. And work backwards from there to how weird is it that we have an economy which pays the most essential people the least, and often the least essential people the most? What could be done about this? How can we imagine some alternatives? So those are a few sort of thoughts about stop sharing, about exploratory social science. I want to take one little detour before pulling the threads together. The detour is one of the really weird features of futures work, which I call the problem materiality bias. When we think about the future, our society generally thinks about stuff, drones, weapons, flying cars. The TV program of my youth, Tomorrow's World, was all about things like planes and cars, and I don't remember them ever discussing transgender identities or climate consciousness or things like that. So it was a very distorted view of tomorrow's world. And that, I think, is pervasive in our culture. We emphasize the things we can touch and feel, like infrastructures and machines, but nearly always underestimate the importance of ideas, of feelings, of the ways, for example, in economies, advances in productivity come every bit as much from new organizational practices, the ways offices or organizations or factories are designed and run, as they do from the computers and the machines. Just as advances in health have come as much from behaviors, social norms, as they've come from sewers and drugs. And this materiality bias blocks, I think, one of the most interesting challenges for social science, which is, how do you think about consciousness in the future? How will people feel and think in the lifetime, perhaps, of your grandchildren, perhaps in the year 2062 we were reflecting on earlier? We know that these changes in how people think about gender or race or ecology have such profound effects, but it's very hard to get a grip on them. In the month of the Jubilee, for example, it's worth recalling 200 years ago, a gathering of this kind would have taken for granted that monarchy was rooted in human nature. It just was a fact of the world that that's how things worked. And most people thought democracy, certainly mass democracy, was an experiment, a nice idea that had been tried and failed. Monarchy was nature. Empire had just been re-established after the convulsions of the Napoleonic Wars. And yet, of course, now we take it for granted that inheritance is not a good way to fill jobs that matter. Now, there is quite a literature on the evolution of consciousness. Many have tried to understand how we move to a bigger sense of our interconnectedness with ecologies. to be more sensitive and understand the perspectives of others, to have a bigger sense of the world we're in, and then to explore our inner selves too. Jean Piaget, Gebser, Keegan, Claire Danes, all of these people tried to make sense of it, and all moving in a direction which I actually think was best summed up by someone from the Zapatista movement in Mexico, who said a movement towards a world where many worlds fit, a kind of pluralism, a breadth of awareness and consciousness. But of course, it's very hard to be definitive, quite hard to really grasp and measure the trends and to see the backlashes, because of course there are backlashes, particularly in times of stress. Yet if we are to have any optimism about the future of the world, it has to be an optimism that we will evolve in our consciousness as well as in our material world. And I do hope we could see better social science trying to both understand and explore and also shape that future consciousness too. So let me conclude on this gorgeous summer's evening, which I'm keeping you from, by returning to the thought experiment, the daydream we began with. I think we are in many ways in a golden age of social science, an extraordinarily rich understanding of the patterns of change in inequality or governance or values or families, a whole array of tools, of analytic tools and data tools and lived experience tools, which were, have become much richer in recent years. But I think we have made it, perhaps if anything, harder to do the necessary work of designing options, possibilities for the future. And yet at a time, if we really are facing multiplying crises, this is exactly the time we need the best brains to be working on. How do you run a zero carbon economy? How do you make ubiquitous smart technologies serve us rather than us serve them? How do we counter polarization, misinformation, all the horrible pathologies which some of the technologies we depend on have left us? And we need to populate our often rather fuzzy pictures of the future with complex, rich, plausible, and hopefully desirable pictures of possibility space to counter the psychological damage which the lack of that picture of the future seems to be doing to our whole world, our whole psychology. And even if there may not be an immediate demand for this from policymakers or anyone else, as governments attend to their immediate problems, it's precisely at times like this we need to look ahead. Just as in the dark days of the 20s and 30s, it was so vital that brilliant social scientists worked on designing welfare states, thinking about how macroeconomics could be designed, or for that matter, planning decolonization, thinking about human rights could be embedded at a global level, or designing United Nations, which of course, 10 years before it was created, seemed utterly utopian, utterly fanciful. Who in the late 30s sensibly would be working on creating a United Nations with a Charter of Human Rights at its core? So indeed, it's precisely at the dark times that this hard work has to be done. 2,000 years ago, Seneca very famously warned, there are no fair winds for those who don't know where they want to go. And right now, I think it's not just our government, which is stuck in a bizarre eternal present of culture wars and tactical maneuvers. It's not just them who seem bereft of a compass or a map. I think perhaps our broader society does too. And we need the social sciences in all their forms, with all their brilliance and methods, to be part of our collective effort to address that and help us navigate what could be some very difficult years ahead. And if this community isn't going to help, who is? So let me end there. Thank you.
Geoff, thank you very much. We have, I think that's really challenging. I love the Seneca quote, that if you don't know where you're going, if you know without a fair wind of knowing where you're going, you're not going to get very far. And the Adam Price in the chapter 10 issue, I remember when I wrote The State We're In, showing the first draft to my wife and my then who's now died on, Jane, and I was so proud of my 8 coruscating chapters in which I really had, diagnosed the problem. And she said, "What are you going to do about it?" And the next 2 chapters, stakeholder capitalism was born. Anyway, there you go. So I do get that. And now, if we have, I'm just looking to see if there's any questions in the chat. Applause! Thank you very much for a brilliant lecture. Once someone else is saying very refreshing and inspiring. Thank you. And there are various other comments, which I will actually, I'll ask you one. I'm going to get you just to kind of speak to one issue that occurred to me while you were lecturing, and then there'll be others, that'll give others an opportunity to kind of, superb lecture, thanks very much, says someone else now. So, you know, a lot of people coming. I mean, how can you simultaneously say that it's, how can you indict social science for not having sufficient possibility space, and then tell us that it's a golden age? I found that slightly tricky. I mean, and of course that, I mean, one area of lack of possibility, it needs, one of the great things, and I mentioned Demos, the thing when go back to the early 90s, mid 90s. I mean, many critics of Tony Blair, but he did open up possibility space for people like you and me to kind of write what we did at that time. And without a demand for it from political leaders or business leaders, it's quite tricky to kind of get there. Over to you. And I look for questions. Right.
Yeah, so I would definitely agree with that. And that was one of the earlier questions, was a bit similar to that. You know, we do depend on there being the economic, political context, the demand, the will to act on things. And that's quite hard to control. I mean, I'm lucky enough to do some of my work in countries like Finland and Germany, where at the moment there are governments with quite a big appetite for quite radical ideas and a willingness to try them out. We don't really have that at the moment in the UK with either the main parties, which for different reasons have become not so interested in this. In relation to what you think was a contradictory thing I said, I guess I would argue this is a golden age of the social science of the present and the past. So everything from extraordinary archaeology and deep history through to the sort of work someone like Thomas Piketty is doing about inequality in the future. And he's, in fact, an example of someone who does also try to make prescriptions, for example, on taxing wealth. But by and large, the golden age is one of understanding, say, present and past, often using extraordinary new tools of data. And I don't think it is a golden age of prescription or of imagination or of proposal. And I don't blame any individual social scientist. I think it is a structural consequence of the reward systems, the funding systems, and to a degree of things like the over-reliance on peer review. My comment, for what it's worth, it wasn't there's materiality bias in answer to Barbara in the social sciences. There definitely isn't in social sciences, but there is in our wider culture. So if you talk to, let's say, a minister about the future, they will immediately think of hardware. They will think of physical stuff and maybe algorithms. It won't even occur to them to think of, you know, shaping futures in terms of behaviors, social organization, and so on. So this is deeply built into, as say, our wider culture, and part of the task of social science is partly to educate people about history and how all the fundamental changes were as much about immaterial things as material things, and then to reorient our R&D systems to reflect that too. So we take social innovation as seriously as we take innovation in aerospace or materials or cars and so on. I hope that partly answers you, Will.
There's so many good points now coming through in the chat and on the questions. I mean, one kind of theme seems to be that it's all very well talking about you know, exploratory social science and kind of borrowing from science fiction writing, but actually that's not the way universities are currently structured, and all the incentives are, you know, not to think systemically, not to think kind of in a future orientation. How do universities restructure themselves to do this? Is it about partnering with people outside universities? What's your answer to that? How, if you're the dean of social science faculty, you think, that's a good idea. What do I do to get there?
So I wrote quite a lengthy answer to that question for an organization in Germany last year called the New Institute, and it's called The Case for Exploratory Social Sciences. If you want a long answer to the question, The short answer is that advocated some things which could be done within disciplines. So if you have like urban planning or economics, but I think the more interesting work is to create cross-disciplinary teams working explicitly on design projects, ideally quite focused ones, like what are the options for a care system in the city of Manchester in 2030, 2040, and bringing together sociology, economics, psychology, engineering, whatever might be relevant sources to generate articulations of possibilities, which then can be interrogated. Are they plausible? Do they fit together? You know, what would it take politically or socially for this to come into fruition? And that's the kind of work I would love to see being done. The universities have all the building blocks for doing that, but it does require different structures, different processes, and different rewards to make it happen.
Does peer review crush it? A point was made in the chat.
Yeah, there has to be some alternative to peer review for more speculative work. Peer review just does not, and as I say, there's been a lot of research on this over the years showing how peer review kills precisely the kind of more radical and often cross-disciplinary thinking. It has its place, and maybe for 80% of the sciences and social sciences it's fine, but have a 20% organized on very different principles.
A lot of people thanking you for your provocative lecture. Just one coming up now. I mean, to what extent? I mean, there's a slight sense, I think, a number of people have, I mean, first of all, don't get this wrong. I mean, there's lots of people are really clapping. You can probably see the chat function yourself. Lots of people applauding what you're saying, and really very. I found your lecture very provocative when I first read it. But you know, your possibility space is remarkably ideology free, and it doesn't confront, you know, the kind of incredible short-termism of our political structures, and actually there are, you know, it's not kind of, you know, you're inviting us to have kind of think as kind of sci-fi writers without ideology, aren't you?
Not at all. And I've got a whole chapter in my book on really ideology in the next 20 or 30 years and its relationship to possibility space. And ideology is one of the tools which in history and in the future helps people to think about new possibilities. Milton Friedman, of course, did that, as did the whole neoliberal project. They opened up using ideology, but then also using economics and other tools, all sorts of different ways you could privatize, deregulate, liberalize, create a different kind of economy and society. They changed the possibility spaces of the UK, possibly not for the better, but that's exactly what they did. Green thinking does the same, you know, looking at radically different ways of organizing cities, rewilding the countryside, perhaps banning meat, transforming our carbon consumption. This is ideologically driven creative imagination, which establishes new spaces into which we can go. The perhaps depressing thing, in my book, I argue probably the most influential ideology right now across the world is technocratic authoritarian nationalism of the kind promoted by President Xi in China, or Erdogan in Turkey, or Bolsonaro, which is a certain way of thinking about the future and solving its problems, but one which very much crushes many of the values which matter to me. And it's precisely because that is now the dominant, arguably, world ideology. It will probably be running the US after the next presidential election. It's even more important that the alternatives are articulated, that there are attractive, plausible alternatives to a reversion to technocratic authoritarian nationalism. And I think the progressives have fallen down in articulating. They've either gone for the purely utopian and implausible, or such incremental proposals that the public isn't energized or inspired at all. And yes, thank you for putting a link to my book in the
well, quite right, and people saying they're keen to read it too. Look, we're into the last 2 or 3 minutes really, and I'm just wondering what to pick out from all the points that have been made. I'd like to know, to pick up the Milton Friedman quote, what ideas do you think are lying around that actually a crisis will lead to policymakers to pick up? What if you had to, come on, let's get you to do some possibility space thinking about that.
Well, there are so many. I think there is a lot of very basic work to be done on inequality and pay and wealth. And this, one of Milton Friedman's successes was to largely squeeze this off the public agenda for several decades. And yet we do need to be trying new methods of doing that. I earlier this year proposed an answer to the problem of the imbalance of pay of essential and inessential workers. My answer may not be right, but at least it's attempting something which could be explored. Another field I'm working on is population level mental health. What do we do if we want to improve the mental health of 20, 30, 40% of our population, not just the most acute needs? And this is a really interesting novel challenge for policymakers, city administration, but also for many parts of social science, to almost do what was done for physical health with the NHS, but do it for well-being and mental health. And then I think there's a whole series of issues about polarization, about avoiding, as it were, the disastrous separation into mutually incomprehending camps, which you see in the US. I was with a group from Brazil earlier today. They say in Brazil exactly the same is happening, as it were, society splitting into two camps which don't trust the bona fides of their other fellow citizens. Now that is disastrous for everything else. So that requires some very serious creative thinking to attend to. And these are difficult, they are deep and difficult problems. And I don't claim to have glib solutions, but they are, I think, reasons why we need a bolder kind of imagination, a willingness perhaps to think more imaginative, more non-obvious thoughts about how to solve them. Otherwise, we will just be, as has a bit happened in the last few years, we'll be observers watching as our nations, our societies go in the wrong direction.
Look, I mean, there's still the questions in the chat still coming on strong. I mean, I'm going to give you one last kind of sign-off point. Actually, I think I'll almost leave it up to you. Actually, I mean, we should wrap this up now. We have a minute or two left.
Well, perhaps I could end with almost a challenge to social science. You are the, the peak of a country which has an extraordinarily strong social science tradition and performs very, very well in global terms at the moment. So if any of my diagnosis is right, what would your prescriptions be? How do we change the rewards for early career researchers? How do we change the ways in which funding supports this? How do we help social science deliver more of the kind of options I was talking about? Does it mean more Cardiff-like social science parks, different ways of organizing interdisciplinary work, more ways of working, perhaps in towns and cities on different kind of futures? I'm not pretending my answers are the best ones, but this needs to be an act of collective intelligence, how we both engage with the diagnosis and the prescriptions. And many of you have a lot of power in your institutions, in your universities. So please, if nothing else, act in better ways than I've proposed, but please at least help the social sciences do even more, do better in helping our wider society to navigate what, as I say, I think is going to be a very difficult few years ahead.
Well, thank you. I'm just looking at the Q&A remarks from Nicole Griffiths, Anne Edwards and others. I mean, people loving your lecture, making the point actually that so you may have wonderful future ideas, but no one notices, and others, you've got a sense of moral purpose. But I think you've acknowledged that. Look, I think it's a phenomenal lecture. I hope the book's a success. And you're a fellow of the Academy. I think we need to, we may take you a little brainstorming session about what we might do with these ideas at the Academy level. I'd be very interested to hear what you think we could do at the Academy. I think I'm speaking to everybody in saying that it was, a tour de force. My only slight criticism is that I spent 10 minutes looking at that rat. When are you going to get that rat off the sharing screen?
Yeah.
Anyway, I admired its feet rather. Anyway, look, we'll get together. Very good luck with your book. Recover from COVID. We'll exploit your ideas at the Academy and try to. And thank you all for the very interesting points that were made in the chat line and in the QA session. And I think we call it all. Actually, I think people are saying here. Others are saying, "I've loved this. Thank you so much. Hugely inspirational. Wonderful," says someone else. So there you are, Geoff. You've really got us going. Thank you all very much for coming. It was a well-attended lecture. We'll put it on the website. I think you've got the transcript. We can even put that on the website as well. Actually, that's helpful to people too. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And we've got lots more coming in on the chat saying thank you, and great and all that. So look,
have a lovely evening.
You've hit a bullseye, Geoff Mulgan.
Thank you,
Sir Geoff Mulgan, CBE. Cheers, Geoff. Bye.